My mother didn't die broke. She died in a twin bed in my brother's spare room, smelling like medicated lotion and old coffee, while the rest of the family sat downstairs arguing about whether it was finally time to sell the house she'd lived in for 41 years. She'd been called a burden for so long, I think she'd started to believe it herself. But here's what none of us knew, what none of them wanted us to know. There was a $1.4 million life insurance policy with her name on it, taken out 22 years ago, paid in full, and the beneficiary had been quietly changed. Twice. The last person to change it? My sister, Renee. And the first time I found out any of this wasn't at the reading of a will. It was from a water stain folder I found stuffed behind a baseboard heater in my mother's old bedroom, the same bedroom that had already been listed on Zillow. Let me back up. My name is Carol. I'm the middle child of 3. There's Kevin, the oldest. He lives outside of Tulsa, calls on birthdays if he remembers. And then there's Renee, the youngest, who has spent the last 15 years being the one who shows up, the one who drives mom to appointments, the one who organizes the Christmas dinner, the one who, I now understand, was always keeping score. I want to be honest with you. I wasn't a perfect daughter. I moved away first. I went to college in Austin, got a job, stayed. I sent money when I could. I called on Sundays. But I wasn't there, not physically. And my mother had that quiet way of making you feel her disappointment without ever saying a word. Just a pause on the phone. A sigh between sentences. You know the kind. So, when Renee stepped in and became the one who handled things, I let her. I told myself she wanted to do it. That she was built for it, the way some people are. The truth is, I was relieved. That's my flaw. I called it love, but really it was convenience. My mother's name was Dorothy. She grew up in a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, married at 20, widowed at 58. She wasn't a complicated woman. She liked her stories on TV, she liked her garden, and she liked to know that the people she loved were okay. She also, apparently, liked having a plan. What I didn't know, what none of us knew except Renee, is that when my father died, he left behind a large life insurance policy. Not for my mother, for all of us. Mom took that money, quietly, and rolled it into a new policy. One with a face value of $1.4 million. She told no one. I think she was proud of it. I think she thought it was her way of making sure we were okay after she was gone. And then, Renee found out about it. I don't know exactly when, but when she did, everything changed. I want to ask you something. If you were me, the one who stayed away, do you think you would have noticed sooner? Leave that in the comments, because I've been asking myself that question for 2 years. The first sign I didn't recognize as a sign was the phone call in February of 2021. Mom called me, and she sounded off. Not sad, not sick, just careful, like she was choosing her words around something sharp. She said Renee had suggested she move in with her and her husband, Derek. Said the house was getting to be too much. Said it made sense financially. I said, Mom, do you want to do that? There was a pause, long enough that I noticed it. She said, Renee thinks it's best. I didn't push. That's the thing I keep coming back to. I didn't push. Mom moved in with Renee in April. I came to visit in June. The guest room my mother was living in was small. Clean, yes, Renee kept everything very clean, but small. There was one window that faced the side of the neighbor's fence. Mom's things were in 2 plastic storage bins in the corner. Her ceramic rooster collection, she'd had it for 30 years, was not there. When I asked where it was, Renee said they'd put it in storage for now. Mom didn't say anything. I noticed the way Derek spoke to her at dinner. Not unkind, exactly. More like she was a guest who had overstayed. He had a way of sighing when she asked for things. A second helping. A different TV channel. He'd do it, but he'd sigh first. And Mom would catch herself, like she'd done something wrong, just by needing. Over the following months, I started to notice other things. Renee had added herself to Mom's bank account. She said it was for convenience, to pay bills, manage groceries. Made sense on the surface. Mom had trouble with the online banking portal. But what I didn't know yet was that Renee had also, sometime in 2020, gotten power of attorney. Mom told me about that casually, over the phone, like it was a minor thing. Renee helped me set up some paperwork. That's exactly what she said. When I asked to see the documents, Renee got quiet. Then she said, "Carol, why are you making this complicated? I'm the one who's here every single day." And you know what? I felt ashamed. Like I had accused her of something. Like I was the villain for asking. That's the thing about someone who's really good at this. They make you feel paranoid for noticing. Renee had a talent for framing. Everything she did had a logical explanation. And if you questioned it, you were the ungrateful one. The absent one. The one who couldn't be bothered to show up but wanted to weigh in from a distance. She wasn't wrong. Exactly. That's the part that made it so hard to fight. Here's what I want to know. If someone uses your guilt against you, uses something true, something real that you actually did wrong, does that make them right? Tell me in the comments. Because I genuinely wrestled with this. In the fall of 2021, Mom had a small stroke. Nothing catastrophic, the doctors called it a TIA, a transient ischemic attack. But it scared everyone. She came home from the hospital with some new medications, a little slower on her feet, and suddenly more dependent. That's when Renee started calling her the situation. Not to Mom's face, but in texts to me and Kevin. The situation is more than I expected. The situation might require professional care soon. I've been talking to Derek about the situation, and we're not sure we can sustain this. My mother had become a pronoun. I flew to Renee's house for Thanksgiving that year. Mom sat at the end of the table, small and a little foggy, while Renee hosted with her matching serving dishes and her scented candles. After dinner, while Mom dozed in the recliner and Derek watched football, Renee and I stood in the kitchen. And she told me, straight out, that she thought Mom needed to go into a facility. She had numbers. She had pamphlets. She'd already toured 3 places. I looked at those pamphlets and felt something cold slide through me. Not because the idea was crazy, Mom did need more care, but because of how ready Renee was. Like she'd been preparing for this conversation for a long time. Like this was a project she'd already managed in her head. I said, "Does Mom want this?" Renee looked at me like I'd said something naive. "Carol," she said, "what Mom wants and what Mom needs are 2 different things at this point." The candle on the counter smelled like cinnamon and pine. The dishwasher was running. And all I could think was, when exactly did my sister stop seeing our mother as a person? Subscribe if this story is hitting something you recognize. Because this isn't just about money. It's about the slow, quiet way a family can decide someone is no longer worth the inconvenience of loving correctly. Mom died on a Wednesday morning in March. I got the call from Renee at 6:47 a.m. She said it was peaceful. She said Mom had passed in her sleep. She said she'd already called the funeral home. I remember standing in my kitchen in Austin, still in my socks, holding the phone against my ear, while the coffee maker beeped 3 times because I'd forgotten to put the carafe in. I flew in the next day. Renee had already handled the arrangements. The funeral was small. The burial was private. And within 72 hours of my mother's death, Renee had filed the insurance claim. I didn't know that last part yet. I found out 6 weeks later. Here's the thing about grief. It slows you down in ways you don't notice until you're already behind. I spent the first month just trying to breathe, calling Kevin, going through old photos, ordering Mom's favorite tea online before I remembered there was no one to send it to. It wasn't until I went back to clear out the last of her things from Renee's guest room that I found the folder. It was behind the baseboard heater, the one that rattled when it came on. The folder was held shut with a rubber band that crumbled when I touched it. Inside were papers. Old ones, mostly. My parents' original mortgage. Some letters. A card I made Mom in 3rd grade. and a policy document from Midwest Heritage Life Insurance, dated 2001. Face value, $1,100,000. I sat down on the floor of that small room with the fence view window, and I read every single page. The original beneficiaries were all three of us, Kevin, Renee, and me, split equally. But there was an amendment, filed in 2019. It designated a single primary beneficiary, Renee Marie Culver. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The room was very quiet. There was a small water stain on the ceiling, shaped like the state of Florida. The heater clicked on and rattled, and then went quiet again. I took photos of every page with my phone. Then, I put the folder in my overnight bag, under a sweater, and I walked downstairs and had lunch with my sister, like nothing had happened. That was the moment I stopped being a grieving daughter and started being something else entirely. I want you to tell me, would you have confronted her right then? Or would you have done what I did? Because I'm still not sure which one of us would have been right. I need to tell you what the audit looked like. Because it wasn't dramatic. It was the most boring, meticulous, exhausting work I've ever done in my life. I hired an estate attorney in Austin. Her name was Patricia, and she had a way of listening without reacting that I found both comforting and slightly unnerving. She explained that challenging a beneficiary change isn't simple. You can't just say it's wrong. You have to show it. You have to prove that at the time of the change, my mother lacked capacity, or that she was under undue influence, or both. So that's what I went looking for. I pulled Mom's medical records from 2019. The amendment was filed in April. In March of that same year, Mom had seen her primary care physician and scored a 21 out of 30 on a cognitive screening, a score that puts you in the mild impairment category. Her doctor had noted it, had flagged it for follow-up. That follow-up never happened, because by then, Renee was managing all the appointments. I called that doctor's office myself. I have a recording of that conversation. I sent a formal medical records request and got 93 pages. Then, I started on the financial records. With Patricia's help, we subpoenaed Mom's bank statements going back 4 years. What we found wasn't a single dramatic heist. It was a slow bleed. Transfers to Renee's account labeled household expenses. Checks written to Derek's contracting business for work done on Renee's house, not Mom's. A $14,000 withdrawal in August 2020 that lined up to the week with Renee and Derek's vacation to Cabo. Renee had been treating my mother's account like a second income for years. I called Kevin, told him everything. There was a long silence, and then he said, "Carol, are you sure?" That's the thing about Kevin. He always needed more certainty than the situation could offer. I told him what I had. I told him to get an attorney of his own. He did. 3 weeks later. Renee didn't know I had the folder. For 2 months, she didn't know. She was moving forward. She'd already received a portion of the insurance payout. The claim had been filed, processed, and partially dispersed while I was still sitting in my grief. She'd put a down payment on a lake house in Tennessee. She'd told her friends and her mother-in-law that Dorothy had left her something. She was building a life on top of what she'd taken. I watched her Instagram, smiling photos, the lake, a new boat, a caption that said, "Mom always wanted us to have something beautiful." She wasn't wrong that Mom wanted that. She was just wrong about who us is included. Patricia filed the contest in probate court in late June. We challenged the beneficiary amendment on 2 grounds, diminished capacity and undue influence. We attached the medical records. We attached the financial statements. We attached a sworn affidavit from Mom's neighbor, a woman named Gloria, who'd known my mother for 27 years, who stated that in the months before the amendment was filed, Dorothy had seemed confused and had told Gloria more than once that Renee was handling everything now, and that she didn't really understand the paperwork anymore. Renee found out on a Thursday. She called me 40 minutes after she was served. I let it go to voicemail. She called back 11 more times that day. Kevin called me too, not to challenge me, just to say, quietly, "You actually did it." I had. Renee hired an attorney, a good one. She pushed back hard, said Mom had been of sound mind, said the change was Mom's own decision, said I was a jealous, absent sister trying to profit off my own guilt. Her attorney requested a deposition. I sat across a conference table from Renee for the first time in 8 months. She looked tired, smaller than I remembered. She kept looking at Derek, who was seated in the back of the room, and he'd give her this small nod, like encouragement. Like a coach. I thought about all the sighs at the dinner table and I felt very, very clear. The deposition lasted 4 hours. I answered every question. I didn't flinch. 2 weeks later, Renee's attorney contacted Patricia with a settlement offer. I need to know, when the other side blinked first, what would you have done? Settle? Or take it all the way? Leave your answer below, because this decision kept me up for a week. We settled. Not because I was tired, not because I was afraid. We settled because Patricia laid out the math and the reality. A full trial would take another 18 months, cost another $40,000 in legal fees, and even with everything we had, verdicts in undue influence cases are never guaranteed. The settlement gave Kevin and me each an equal share of what should have been ours from the beginning. Renee kept a portion, less than she'd planned on, far less than she'd already spent, and she was required to repay a significant amount of the financial transfers. The lake house went back on the market 4 months later. I don't feel triumphant about that. I want to be honest with you about that. There was no moment where I pumped my fist or felt like justice had a clean shape. There was just a Tuesday afternoon when Patricia called and said it was over, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Target in South Austin, and I cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since Mom died. Because here's what winning actually looked like. It looked like a number in a settlement document. It looked like Renee and Kevin and I never speaking again. It looked like a family that had already been fraying just, finishing the tier completely. Kevin and I talk sometimes now. Not often. There's too much wreckage between all of us for it to feel normal. And my mother is still gone. The money didn't fix that. Nothing fixes that. What I think about now is the folder. About why Mom kept it. She didn't hide it. Not really. She tucked it behind a heater in the room she was living in. The room they'd given her. I think she knew, on some level, that something wasn't right. I think she wanted someone to find it. I think she was leaving a trail for whoever loved her enough to look. I just wish I'd looked sooner. That's the scar I carry. Not the legal battle. Not the money. The fact that my mother spent her last years in a small room with a fence-view window, wondering if anyone was paying attention, and I was the one she was waiting on. I just got there late. If you have an elderly parent, if there's someone in your family who's been quietly sidelined, who's become the situation to someone, please pay attention. You don't have to be suspicious. You just have to show up. That's all she needed. Tell me in the comments if this hit home. Renee and I haven't spoken since the settlement. I don't know that we ever will. She wasn't a monster. She was a person who decided that her need was more important than my mother's dignity, and that the people who weren't watching wouldn't notice. She was almost right. Almost.